You have to imagine a city so feared that the mere sight of its standards on the horizon could make kings reconsider a campaign. And yet on a single terrible night, that same city would be declared fallen. Nineveh, the city that fell in one night. It is a paradox that draws us in. How could an apparatus of iron, bureaucracy, and terror, an empire that could march, tax, deport, and reshape populations, be undone with such suddenness? To answer that is to read inscriptions and prophets, to listen to archaeological soil and the fractures in human hearts. It is also to stand before an uncomfortable theological mirror. What does it mean when an instrument of judgment becomes itself judged? We will hold Nineveh at the center of our gaze. Around it orbit the techniques that built Assyrian rule: geography, iron, professional soldiers, administrative files, and the moral logic prophets sought to expose. Along the way, we will look at older and neighboring episodes, especially the night the Assyrian advance against Judah is remembered as stopped by a supernatural reversal. That Jerusalem story serves as a foil. It shows how the Bible frames Assyria both as God's instrument and as a nation accountable before God. Keep that comparison in the back of your mind as we trace how the machine was made and how it was undone. If this subject touches you, stay with me. There is more ahead worth that patience. Subscribe and return for the full exploration that follows this opening line of inquiry. Assyria begins, in a sense, with place. The Tigris corridor, rocky uplands folding into riverine plains, gave the small state a defensible heartland and easy access to trade routes stretching from Anatolia to the Iranian plateau. That geography did more than shelter a people. It concentrated ambition. Sitting where trade and transit converged, Assyrian centers could tax goods, conscript men, and deploy wealth into military investment. The rivers were not just lifelines, they were the highways of an imperial vocation. Technology deepened that advantage. By the early first millennium BCE, communities in the Levant and Mesopotamia had adopted iron weapons and tools in a widespread fashion. Iron, compared to bronze, could be produced from more widely available ore, and when worked well, created harder, more durable implements. The result was a steady increase in the scale and lethality of warfare. Assyrian smiths and workshops turned raw material into swords, spears, and chariot fittings. Their economy rewarded the craftsmen who could arm a state at scale. Where once armies were ad hoc bands summoned for a season, the Iron Era made sustained field forces possible. But materials alone do not make an empire. Assyria's true innovation was institutional, the professionalization of war. Kings moved beyond seasonal levies to maintain standing troops. Soldiers trained, paid, and provisioned year-round. This required logistics, granaries, stable lines of supply, standardized rations, and the administrative intelligence to move men across distance. To keep such an army meant collecting reliable revenue, which in turn required a bureaucracy. Tax lists, provincial administrations, and records. Assyria learned to govern the conquered as much as to defeat them. Governors, garrison towns, and networks of roads knitted newly subjugated territories into an imperial web. Consider a typical campaign in its anatomy. A ruler would call an expedition, set out with cavalry, chariots, and infantry, and make use of engineers and sappers skilled in siegecraft. Siege ramps, battering rams, and portable siege towers were not mere inventions of improvisation. They were technologies honed through practice. Engineers could undermine walls, erect wooden devices to breach gates, and plan the approach with surprising efficiency. Behind the front lines, quartermasters kept lists of animals, measured grain for the months ahead, and arranged fodder for horses. Supply wagons and depots turned warfare into an exercise in administration. If war is logistics, Assyria was among the ancient world's master logisticians. This administrative muscle was captured in visual form on palace walls. Take the reliefs carved into the stone of royal palaces, rows of spearmen, scenes of siege, deportation columns, and the king at the center as conductor of it all. These images were propaganda, certainly, lessons carved for visitors and subjects alike, but they were also records, sometimes literal illustrations of campaigns and policies. The relief served a dual purpose. to celebrate military prowess and to instruct, warning citizens and neighbors of the cost of resistance. That same visual rhetoric reinforced the idea that the empire did not merely fight, it transformed. Transformation was not limited to territories. Deportation was a central policy, an instrument of control that also remade the map of peoples. When Assyria subdued a city, it often removed significant segments of its population, artisans, religious specialists, and other groups useful to imperial aims, and resettled them elsewhere in the empire. Deportation served several purposes at once. It prevented revolt by breaking local solidarities, it supplied labor to imperial projects, and it redistributed skills where the state wanted them. The long-term social consequences were profound. When diverse populations were uprooted and mixed, identities loosened and new communities formed. Scholars have suggested that such movements contributed to later hybrid groups in the region, including elements that would be perceived as Samaritans by Judeans centuries later. That process was not only administrative, it was humanly costly. To give a face to that cost, imagine a craftsman we will call Eliam, a potter from a northern township taken to heartland provinces after his city fell. He crosses the imperial highway with a bundle of tools and a wife whose grief is a quiet weight. Deportation does not merely move people, it disorients them. That potter's skills may be prized in a new place, but he will never again stand in the courtyard of his childhood houses. Children learn new tongues. Rituals change as altars and festivals are interrupted. The state gains productive labor. Families lose ancestral anchors. Assyrian policy treated culture as a malleable resource, and those who were uprooted often became the silent vectors of cultural transformation. Against this web of instruments, iron, cavalry, engineers, tablets, governors, Assyria exercised a different, subtler power, psychological warfare. The palace reliefs we just mentioned were one channel. Public funerary monuments, obelisks, and the iconography of captives and flayed enemies were meant to communicate a simple arithmetic to anyone who passed. Resistance brings humiliation. Diplomacy could be a performance in humiliation as well. The biblical scene of Rabshakeh standing outside Jerusalem's walls and taunting its leaders was not a mere moment of diplomatic arrogance. It was a deliberate tactic of intimidation. The envoy did not only deliver terms, he sought to demonstrate the futility of opposition, to inflame doubt within walls, and to encourage capitulation without siege. This is where ancient rhetoric and statecraft meet the prophetic imagination. Israel's prophets were not uninterested spectators. They read Assyrian power as theological reality, at times God's rod to chastise, at times an agent liable to judgment. Amos, Isaiah, and later Nahum and Zephaniah respond to the empire's violence by interpreting it through covenantal categories. Assyria's brutal means, prophets argued, did not exempt it from moral scrutiny. Indeed, for prophetic writers, the very tools that made Assyria powerful were ethically charged. The machine of empire required moral examination. The encounter between Assyria and the small kingdoms of the Levant presents an instructive pattern of choices: tribute, vassalage, rebellion. For many city-states and minor kingdoms, the calculus was survival. To pay tribute and accept a vassal treaty could spare a city the brutal consequences of conquest. No mass deportation, limited garrisoning, perhaps some autonomy under a compliant client ruler. For others, resistance provoked the full machinery of Assyrian reprisals. The fall of Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel, in the 9th and 8th centuries BCE exemplifies the cumulative nature of these pressures. Political fragmentation, internal weakness, and the relentless pressure of Assyrian policy combined to produce that collapse. After conquest, Assyria restructured the territory. Elites were displaced or incorporated, new administrative units established, and deportations ensured that the old networks of resistance could not reform easily. The biblical witness and the Assyrian inscriptions sometimes intersect and sometimes diverge in emphasis. When we read about these episodes in Scripture, we must read them reverently as theological messages, not merely as dry annals. Isaiah condemns the moral failures that make Judah vulnerable. Amos denounces the social abuses that invite judgment. Zephaniah and Nahum later exult in prophetic vindication when the empire's violence is turned back. Yet the prophets also offer sobering theology. Instruments of judgment can themselves be judged. That paradox sits at the heart of the Nineveh narrative. One of the moments where Scripture remembers the Assyrian machine being unexpectedly halted is the episode surrounding Sennacherib's campaign against Judah. The royal inscriptions of Sennacherib, the chronicles he set in stone, speak with blunt pride. He claims to have trapped Hezekiah like a bird in a cage, bathed in the rhetoric of conquest. The biblical narrative, however, preserves a different witness. According to the account in the book of Isaiah and in the parallel account in 2 Kings, there occurs an overnight reversal. An army counted in the thousands is stricken, an angel moves, and Jerusalem is spared from capture. The text treats this as an act of divine intervention, clear, decisive, and theologically freighted. How do we hold these two testimonies together, with reverence and care? The biblical claim is a theological assertion about God's protecting action for a people in covenant. For those who read Scripture as authoritative, the event stands as such. Historians and archaeologists, approaching the evidence by different criteria, explore possible natural mechanisms that might explain a sudden collapse of an enemy army. Epidemic disease, perhaps an outbreak of plague that would quickly incapacitate a densely camped force. A sudden environmental catastrophe, logistical breakdown, or even political disintegration within the Assyrian command. Scholars propose these as hypotheses, not as rebuttals of faith claims. To frame them otherwise would be to misuse archaeological inference against theological testimony. We should be careful, too, with the rhetoric we borrow. To call such possible mechanisms natural explanations is not to reduce the biblical event to mere chance. It is to acknowledge the historian's method. We ask what physical or social processes could produce rapid military failure. The biblical text, read on its own terms, attributes the deliverance to God. The historian, meanwhile, looks to the data on disease vectors, camp sanitation, and recorded conditions of siege warfare. Both perspectives can coexist in a careful reading, one addressing meaning, the other causation. What matters for our present inquiry is that the memory of a sudden, almost cosmically swift counterstroke, an army felled in one night, remains potent in the biblical imagination. It becomes a motif, a way of saying that empire is not unassailable. That motif will later shadow the story of Nineveh. If we step back from singular incidents and consider the arc of Assyrian history, another pattern emerges: cultural apex followed by administrative overstretch. Under rulers such as Ashurbanipal, Nineveh blossomed as more than a military capital. It became a center of knowledge. The palaces and libraries, Ashurbanipal's library among them, contained centuries of records, myths, medical texts, and administrative tablets. The clay tablets recovered in modern excavations show an empire capable not only of crushing force, but also of intellectual curiosity. Catalogs of texts, copies of ancient literature, and bureaucratic ledgers all tell of a complex society that recorded itself obsessively. Such documentation can be read in two registers. On one hand, the library suggests an empire at its cultural and administrative zenith, enough surplus and stability to patronize scholars, scribes, and collectors. On the other hand, that very accumulation of records makes clear how extensive and demanding imperial governance had become. The more an empire knows about its provinces, their taxes, their inhabitants, their economic patterns, the more it relies on that knowledge to function. Bureaucracy amplifies capacity. It also amplifies vulnerability. A defeat in one theater, a breakdown in harvests, or a coalition of enemies can expose how reliant power has become on a fragile network of economic and administrative dependencies. In the last decades of Assyria's imperial life, the state carried the weight of its own making. Campaigns required large sums, provincial governance demanded personnel, deportation policies required continuous policing. At the same time, new enemies were learning from Assyrian methods. Babylonian and Median leaders, along with disaffected former vassals, began to forge alliances that would turn imperial instruments back against the center. Coalitions of enemies, once a distant threat, became a strategic reality. Imperial overstretch, an economic and military strain born of constant expansion, set the stage for catastrophe. The very techniques that had given Assyria dominance, mobilization, deportation, engineering, now multiplied the empire's liabilities. We are approaching the moment where the empire's outer machinery and inner moral calculus intersect. Prophetic voice had long warned of the moral deficits that accompanied unchecked power. Now, as neighborhoods of allies turned into theaters of rebellion and deserts of loyalty widened, the stage was set for a convulsion. Yet the convulsion is not immediate. Coalitions must form. Enemies must coordinate. Supply chains must fray. The story of Nineveh's fall is not merely a tale of siege engines and starving walls. It is a chronicle of political realignments, of opportunistic timing, and of a region exhausted by decades of coercion. Even as the empire's capital showcased its achievements, palaces glittering with carved victories and libraries heavy with texts, the ground beneath it was shifting. We will return to the siege itself. For now, hold the image of Ashurbanipal's library, rows of clay tablets, the scratch of reed pens, the deliberate hand that copied myth and law. Next to the image of deportation columns, the caravan of families and artisans marching to foreign towns. These two images, placed side by side, reveal the strange duality of Assyrian hegemony, cultural sophistication built upon coercive foundations. Culture and brutality were not opposites but parts of one system. Before we reach the final unraveling at Nineveh, it helps to linger with one more feature of Assyrian statecraft: the rhetoric of kingship. Assyrian monarchs were not shy about their divinely sanctioned role. Royal inscriptions paint the king as chosen by the chief god, an executor of cosmic order. This ideology had practical effects. It justified campaigns as restorations of order. It demanded loyalty from provincial elites, and it framed resistance as sacrilege. But when kings cast themselves as the axis of cosmic order, they invited a corresponding moral scrutiny. If the king is God's instrument, then his conduct is not exempt from ethical judgment. Prophetic literature seizes that tension. Prophets accuse rulers and peoples alike of false piety that masks exploitation. Here a small vignette is useful. Picture a prophet on a city wall, looking out toward the imperial banners on the horizon. He has watched governors demand heavy levies. He has heard the deportation lists read aloud. He has seen the reliefs that show captives pressed into labor. He speaks not only to the ruling class, but to ordinary people whose lives are catalogued and moved. His words indict both the conqueror and the conquered who profit from injustice. The prophetic voice insists that power is not merely a fact to be managed. It is a moral responsibility. This leads us away from technical descriptions of siegecraft and into the ethical vocabulary that the prophets insist upon. Assyria's machine was effective, often devastatingly so, but effectiveness did not make it righteous. Remember that these critiques are not modern anachronisms imposed upon an ancient culture. They are coeval judgments raised by Israelite and Judean thinkers who had to make sense of suffering and triumph in theological terms. And so we have traced several threads: the geographical and technological seeds of Assyrian power, the administrative and military innovations that gave it scale, the psychological deployments of propaganda and intimidation, the human cost of deportation, the fraught interactions with the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, the theological pushback from the prophets, and the wear and tear of imperial overstretch. We have also placed the memory of a night when God is said to have intervened on Jerusalem's behalf into this broader tapestry as a motif that will reappear at Nineveh's end. What remains is the climax that the title promises: Nineveh's fall in one night. Before we step into that final act, however, we must consider the coalition building and the specific pressures that made a direct assault on the imperial capital possible. Enemies that had once feared Assyrian power learned to coordinate. Babylon, long a rival, joined forces with the Medes and other groups who had suffered under Assyrian dominion. Internal divisions within Assyria, Dynastic strife, the burdens of continuous warfare, and the strains on provincial loyalties created openings. The empire, administratively intricate, militarily formidable, culturally rich, had become brittle in new ways. When antagonists choose to strike at the heart of empire, a certain audacity is required. Siege lines must be established, coalitions must be kept together, and logistics must be managed across plains that the Assyrians had sought to control. Siegecraft would still matter, ramps, towers, sappers, but so would timing and alliance. If a single night could witness the fall of an army outside Jerusalem, then a single coordinated campaign might bring down a capital that had for decades seemed impregnable. We are now approaching that night, the pivot in which the instruments of empire are tested against the fragilities they themselves created. The stage is set, rival polities aligned, imperial overstretch evident, the psychological costs of deportation and terror reverberating through the region. Prophetic voices wait in the margin, ready to interpret the outcome. The clay tablets, the reliefs, and the royal inscriptions will all have to be read together with the rubble and the human testimonies to assemble the full picture. It is here, at this threshold, that we pause. The story of Nineveh's sudden fall is not merely a military narrative. It is the unfolding of a moral drama in which technology, ideology, and human choice converge. We will cross that threshold and witness the night itself, its drama, and its aftermath. But first we must follow through on the threads we have begun to untangle, tracing the immediate political alignments and catalytic moments that made the assault on Nineveh conceivable. Only then can we properly understand why an empire that had once seemed to order the world could be declared fallen in the space of a single night. The coalition that struck at the heart of Assyria did not arrive fully formed like a thunderclap. It was the result of years of patient calculation, mutual grievance, and opportunistic diplomacy. Babylon had tasted Assyrian dominance for generations and bided its time until a leadership, Nabopolassar, as many inscriptions and later historians indicate, seized an opening. To the east, Median forces under a ruler whom sources call Cyaxares had their own reasons: loss, humiliation, the desire for autonomy, disaffected vassals, provincial governors tired of distant oversight, and nomadic groups who could be enlisted as light cavalry all contributed to a broad front. Scholars suggest that what made the assault on Nineveh possible was less a single invention than the slow accumulation of pressure. Coordinated armies, learned siegecraft adopted from Assyrian practice, and enough internal weakness in the imperial center to amplify external strikes. Imagine the planning in those years before the final campaign. Messengers rode at night, treaties were sealed with oaths and hostages, supplies were gathered across disparate territories. Where once Assyria had sent out columns and counted rations with terrifying exactitude, now those same columns would have to meet each other in the field and share the burdens of a joint enterprise. The Medes and Babylonians in particular brought complementary strengths: Babylonian urban knowledge, Median cavalry, and the willingness of other peoples to join a coalition that promised a new balance of power. Inside Nineveh, the capital still bore the signs of imperial self-confidence. The great walls, long the symbol of Assyrian might, rose in broad bands of mud brick faced with stone. The palaces along the riverbank shimmered, reliefs still caught light, depicting hunts, sieges, and the king's triumphs. The library of Ashurbanipal, a repository of history and myth, was a monument to the empire's intellectual reach. Scribes copied myths of Gilgamesh, medical recipes, astronomical observations, and the bureaucratic tablets that kept taxes and allocations in order. The very things that testified to the empire's accomplishments, palaces, archives, monumental art, would also become the evidence by which later generations would measure its end. The siege itself, insofar as the archaeological record and contemporary inscriptions allow us to paint it, may have involved several complementary operations. One column of the attackers might have pressed a long encirclement to cut supplies and isolate the city. Another could have probed for weak points in the walls, while engineers prepared ramps and siege machines. There are plausible reconstructions in which rivers were diverted or exploited to undermine foundations. Classical accounts and some modern reconstructions propose that flooding helped break walls. Yet these technical theories remain debated. Fire, too, has a clearer archaeological signature. The presence of ash layers, charred beams, and burned administrative archives indicate that conflagration played a role in the city's destruction. Whether the flames were the result of intentional incendiary tactics, accidental spread amid the chaos of assault, or internal civil strife cannot be settled beyond question. Scholars weigh the evidence and label conclusions as probable or possible, not certain. Consider for a moment the human dimension within the walls. Families would have packed precious goods and fled between inner courts. Craftsmen like Eliam's descendants might have run to warehouses to salvage tools. Scribes clutched tablets and tried to hide archives in cellars, not fully understanding whether clay tablets, baked or unbaked, could survive the fall. Priests tended to altars even as the sound of engines and the rumble of machinery came closer. Rumors of betrayal and the real possibility of internal revolt circulated in the narrow streets. When an empire's own mechanisms falter, when garrison loyalty wavers, when tax revenues dry up, when provincial governors hedge their bets, the signal that kept administrative order can blink out. In the narratives that emerged afterwards, whether in Babylonian triumphal inscriptions or in prophetic exaltation from the Levant, the collapse is often rendered as swift and almost fated. For the prophets who had long denounced Assyrian brutality, the fall was a vindication. The instrument of punishment had itself been judged. Nahum's rhetoric is one of poetic satisfaction and theological resolution. He writes in a voice that finds in Nineveh's downfall a moral correction. Zephaniah and other prophetic texts join this chorus, not as gloating on human suffering, but as theologically insisting that power must answer to justice. Their language is vivid. Walls cast down, caverns filled, the city's revelry silenced. For readers of Scripture, such words are testimony that God's governance includes nations and empires. We must not, however, allow prophetic vindication to slide into triumphalist celebration of violence. The fall of Nineveh meant the death, despair, and displacement of untold numbers. Deportations under Assyrian policy had created layered populations across the empire. Now, in its collapse, refugees layered the landscape once more. Women, men, and children carried the exhaustion of a long era that had been sustained by coercion. It is vital that our narrative holds the prophetic rhetoric alongside the human cost. The prophet's metaphor of judgment and the real names of those who suffered must both be honored. What did the fall of Nineveh mean politically? The immediate consequence was the fragmentation of a centralized order. With the capital's destruction, the imperial coordination of taxation, law, and military mobilization broke down. Babylon and the Medes claimed the victory, but empire itself, as an organizing form, blurred into multiple successor states. Large swaths of territory entered new patterns of autonomy, or came under different spheres of control. The Assyrian administrative machine, which had relied on provincial records and loyal governors, found itself disconnected. The tablets smoldered not merely as burnt clay but as the end of a system that had, for centuries, imposed and shaped lives. Archaeology gives us a mournful afterimage. Excavations at Nineveh's mound have revealed levels of destruction, collapsed palatial remains, scorched deposits, and a scattering of personal items. The clay tablets of Ashurbanipal's library, many of which had been baked to preserve them, survived in surprising numbers beneath the debris. Centuries later, in the modern era, explorers and archaeologists would unearth those tablets, and in the act of recovery, the ancient world's voice regained a measure of speech. Reading those clay records today, we hear not only the state's administrative rhythms but also the myths and medical treatises that reflect human curiosity and daily life. The recovery of those texts is in itself an ethical moment. It is both a rescue of cultural memory and a reminder that human creativity often flourishes even under coercive systems. There is a theological rhythm to be discerned here. The prophets had essentially argued, sometimes with the blunt force of poetic imagery, that God uses nations to correct moral evils, but does not absolve them of responsibility. The instruments God employs are not moral agents in themselves, They are human polities, subject to the same ethical demands as the peoples they judge. Assyria, therefore, is presented in prophetic literature as both instrument and target, a tool raised up to rebuke, but also a polity judged for its own crimes. In the Nineveh narrative, that paradox reaches a theatrical climax. The city that had once been presented as the axis of order collapses, and the collapse is narrated as both a political event and a moral adjudication. This brings us to a theological posture that refuses simple answers. For readers inclined to see direct cause and effect, the fall of Nineveh might seem like moral retribution. For historians, the evidence points to logistics, warfare, and political coalition. Both readings can coexist without canceling each other out. Theological meaning speaks to purpose and moral order, while historical causation addresses mechanisms. To hold both in tension is to practice intellectual humility. We can say reverently that the fall is interpreted theologically as judgment, and we can also say with scholarly restraint that the siege likely involved a combination of coordinated assault, internal weakness, and the breakdown of supply lines, perhaps exacerbated by famine or fire. There is another lesson tied to the archive. Memory is fragile, and it must be guarded. When we read prophetic texts or administrative lists, we are reading fragments of human lives mediated through official channels. The Assyrian record is extensive, but it is not exhaustive. It records triumphs more than defeats, taxes more than names of those displaced. The prophetic corpus fills some of those lacunae by speaking directly to the human cost, and by insisting that God's interest is not merely political equilibrium, but justice for the oppressed. Our modern ethical task is to listen to both sources, to the dry ledger that tells us how empires operated, and to the prophetic cry that reminds us whose voices are missing from those ledgers. If Nineveh fell in one night as a literary motif, what does that phrase mean for us? It compresses complex causes into a memorable moral point. Empires that seem steady can collapse swiftly when their moral and material supports fail. The night image matters because it forces us to reckon with contingency. The same political machine that counts rations and draws maps is still subject to accidents, alliances, and moral failures. The suddenness of collapse is not always caused by a single dramatic event. Often it is the visible end of processes that have been at work for decades. The night simply frames the moment of exposure. That motif of sudden reversal has another function in the biblical imagination. It offers hope to the vulnerable and a warning to the powerful. To those who suffer under domination, it promises that injustice is not eternal. To those who wield power, it warns that success can breed complacency and moral myopia. The prophets aim at both audiences simultaneously. They console the dispossessed and rebuke the privileged. We should then bring these reflections home. What does Nineveh's fall teach us about power, responsibility, and memory today? First, systems are morally neutral until people decide their ends. Technology, logistics, and administration can be used to relieve suffering or to intensify exploitation. The Assyrians perfected instruments that could be harnessed for public good. They used those same instruments to depopulate cities and to project terror. That duality should sober contemporary admirers of efficiency and remind critics that institutions require moral oversight. Second, power inevitably creates distance between rulers and the ruled. The Assyrian king's rhetoric declared divine sanction, and that sanctification insulated policy from ethical scrutiny. The prophetic voice that insisted on accountability is a model we would do well to heed. Legitimacy without moral conduct is hollow. Whether in civic life, corporate governance, or ecclesial structures, the same tension appears. The more authority claims unconditional assent, the higher the risk of corruption and harm. Third, memory matters. The victims of deportation and empire were often erased from official histories. Later communities, like the Samaritans, carry complex genealogies shaped in part by displacement. Modern societies thus inherit layered identities and resentments that sometimes outlast the powers that created them. Studying Nineveh forces us to take the long view of policies that uproot peoples. The consequences are not merely immediate, they ripple across generations. Fourth, prophetic critique remains indispensable. Voices that name injustice, insist on compassion, and refuse the seductions of power are the conscience of any polity. The prophets of Israel and Judah, while formed in their own contexts, modeled a civic vocabulary in which theological and ethical claims challenged political expedience. Their work is not to be romanticized, but it is to be listened to. At the end of the story, when the dust settled and the city was a ruin, some of what the Assyrian world had produced survived only in fragments, baked tablets, broken reliefs, and oral echoes that crept into neighboring cultures. The fall did not erase human creativity, but it did reorder its centers. Babylon rose anew. Other regions gained autonomy. Populations adjusted to new patterns of life. The moral and human lesson is not simply that hubris is punished, but that the architecture of power shapes human possibility. Institutions that do not incorporate justice and mercy into their codes will, sooner or later, face ruptures. We conclude then with a sober reflection that resists neat moralizing. Nineveh's story is, on one level, a narrative of collapse. A capital burned and broken, an empire dissolved. On another level, it is an indictment and a plea. Indictment of cruelty, plea for justice. The prophets who proclaimed Nineveh's doom did so with a voice both fierce and pained. They named the wrongs they had seen and called for a different order. The archaeological record and the administrative tablets give us the mechanisms. The prophets give us the why. Before we close, let us attend to the human faces in that sweep of history. Picture once more a scribe in Nineveh, his hands stained with clay and ink, who had copied a prayer from a temple scroll and tucked it among bureaucratic tablets. The invading force comes, fires light up the riverbank. He buries his tablets or hides them beneath floorboards. Centuries later, some of these tablets emerge in modern hands and grant us partial access to his life, his lists, his prayers, his mundane concerns. That scribe's unnamed life reminds us that behind every system are individuals whose dignity calls for remembrance. As we leave the story of Nineveh, the city that fell in one night, we should feel both the humility and the responsibility that come with historical knowledge. We must resist both easy triumphalism and sterile fatalism. Empires are not moral absolutes. They are human creations that can be repurposed toward life or toward harm. To study Nineveh is to reckon with the possibility that systems can be instruments of justice or instruments of oppression. Our own task is to cultivate the civic and spiritual virtues that shape institutions toward mercy and accountability. Share this episode with someone who cares about history, justice, or the biblical witness. Comment below with a passage or image from the story that stayed with you. What did you hear in the prophet's cry? Which image of the fallen city lingers? Let us close with a brief word of prayer. Short, communal, and attuned to the themes we have explored. Sovereign God, whose ways confound worldly wisdom, we remember the lives caught in the sweep of empire, the nameless, the exiled, the scribes and artisans who shaped and suffered beneath great walls. Grant us humility to learn from the past, courage to resist systems that dehumanize, and wisdom to steward institutions toward justice. Teach us to honor memory, to care for the displaced, and to live with the reverence the prophets demanded. Amen. Subscribe for further explorations of history, theology, and the difficult questions that sit between them. Thank you for listening and for keeping these stories alive. May God bless you. Be at peace.